Assalamu alaikum and a very good day to our viewers. Once again, we are back with our part 2 discussing the origins of the two-nation theory, and I am in conversation with Dr. Pervez Hoodbhoy in relation to his brilliant, I think in my opinion, new book called Pakistan, Origins, Identity and Future. And we have been discussing the part 1 of the book, which is the identity and, in fact, the coming of the British rule and what it did to the identity of the colonized. So, Dr. Hoodbhoy, let us now turn to the British colonial rule in India and what it wrought. Why did the Mughal Empire collapse? In fact, indeed, because you refer to it, why did the Ottoman Empire, which was from 14th to 20th century, and the Safavid Empire from 1501, and you say 1736, all of those empires, the Mughal, the Ottoman, the Safavid empires collapsed too? Or to ask it another way, why did Europe rise to colonize and dominate much of the world?
Great question. These three empires, Ottoman, Safavid and Mughal, they basically collapsed roughly at the same time. And they collapsed because they were essentially extractive. They didn't create new products. They didn't create new science, technology, and that was being created in Europe at that particular time. There was the Renaissance, there was the scientific revolution, and then the technological revolution, the industrial revolution. Now, that is what made it possible for the British to colonize vast areas of the world. The sun would never set over the British Empire, as they said. When the British came to India, they came as traders. There was then the British East India Company, and by the way, they never fought any major wars, except you could say the Battle of Plassey and the Battle of Buxar, but that's it. The way they made their way.
It was just very easy in a way, what you're saying, to conquer India. They didn't need to fight too much.
They didn't need to fight too much. They needed ways of control. Of course, they got the locals fighting each other. They had resistance. Well, Tipu Sultan put up a brilliant defense in Mysore. But by and large, it was done because they were scientifically organized. And it's not just a question of technology. Sure, they had cannons, sure, they had telegraph, and later on they brought with them more modern things, the railway and so forth. But it was a particular way of thinking that was based upon scientific principles and then upon administration. Now, the Mughals were very great people in the sense that they built beautiful mausoleums and gardens and mosques and so forth, but they didn't ever make a single university, and there was no interest in what was going on in Europe at that time, which was actually bubbling, boiling. It was in a state of intellectual ferment. Mm-hmm. So in this book, here's the book. Yeah. Here it is. I make the case that all these things are coming in. Mm-hmm. The British ambassador, Sir Thomas Roe, comes in with a trunk full of new stuff. There's telescopes, there's eyeglasses, there's various kinds of pressure gauges and so forth. And he shows this to Emperor Jahangir. Mm-hmm. And he says, yeah, very nice. How much can I buy this for? Exactly what is happening today. There was no attempt made to understand how these things made, how to make them. Mm-hmm. And well, then we know that over time the Mughal Empire, starting from its heydays at Akbar's time, it then loses steam, and well, its last period of greatness is Aurangzeb, and thereafter it's progressively winds down until 1857, when Bahadur Shah Zafar is the last Mughal emperor. Okay, now if you ask why did the Mughal Empire collapse, and the Safavid and the Ottomans. It's because they didn't innovate. They were basically extractive. Their wealth came from the peasant, from the toiler of the soil. It didn't come from making a way of, let's say, manufacturing cloth or utensils or steel or whatever. And so eventually they went under. Now we can ask, well, what happened? Now, since we are talking about the two-nation theory, fundamentally, I mean, in this book, what I want to do is understand how the two-nation theory came about. Sure, there was, even at the time of the Mughals, a difference between the Muslims and the Hindus. The Muslims, they were great at fighting wars, they were good at administrating lands, but they weren't really interested in doing the finances. They didn't want to spend their time doing sums and calculations and working out interest and working out how the land distribution is to be made in a geometrical progression and so forth. They left that up to the Hindus. It was supposed to be low-level work. Maths, arithmetic was low-level work for them. And also trading. So trading was left up to the Hindu community, basically. Now, over time, what this meant was that there was a steady degradation in terms of certain skills. And now come the British. And it's the British era that led to the widening of this relatively small difference.
Okay, we'll come to this, to the British, but let me now summarize sort of what you basically said, that the reason for the decline of, if you will, the Muslim empires, including the Mughals, were because they had lost superiority on technology in terms of armaments, new skills, particularly in terms of administration and how wars can be fought and large wars can be fought. They were extractive. There's been, some people have cited another reason, particularly in, which I just like your thoughts on, that the Mughal structure of the society never had land given to the landowners in perpetuity. So the land was always the crown's land that reverted back to the crown, with the result that the people who held, who were never had they were never invested in the land that they lived in because it was never theirs. Unlike, for instance, in Britain, where there were huge like lords, which had lots of influence around the world, and it was the lords that then came and supported the crown. So when the British came, the quickness with which the Mughal Empire collapsed was one reason people cite, the historians cite, is that there was never a structure where there was, the stakeholders didn't have the stake, if you will, in the land. Do you agree with that, this argument?
Yeah, it's, I think, pretty straightforward that if everything belongs to the state, to the emperor, then you don't feel particularly motivated to defend that. And so, well, it's only a question of your getting friendly with the
new invaders,
with the new invaders, with the new hierarchy that comes. You know that the land that you're working on will not stay with you. It will not stay in your family. It will be taken back whenever. And so you won't, for example, work out how to irrigate it in a way that will stay over decades. You work it out so that you can get something from the land over a year, 2 years, 5 years, but not over 50 years.
50 years. So now we come to the British. They have come in. There is a period of the British. They have been making an ingress. They've been coming into the society from the 17th century. Now it's the middle of the 18th century. They have kind of quite a major hold starting in Bengal. So there's the 1750s to 1857 is one period, and then the mutiny or the War of Independence, as we call it, happens, and there is another period. How would you compare and contrast these two periods?
Okay, so before 1857, many things were happening. It's that the British were consolidating the rule across India. They'd already built railway lines. They had now worked out arrangements with all the locals over there. The ones who had resisted the British had been moved away. The Mughal Empire had been whittled down, and no longer was the imprint on the coins at that time that of the reigning Mughal emperor. That was done with, and so there was Mughal rule only in name. Basically, the English had taken over. Now, here was the problem. There were only a handful of Britishers. How many? Varies from time to time, but at no point were there more than 50,000 whites in India, and not all of them were soldiers. Now, how do you administer a country as huge as India? Well, you've got to get locals involved in this. How do you get locals who are capable of this? Well, you have to teach them English. You have to teach them enough of modern sciences, modern knowledge, so that they can actually do the job. If you want them to do accounts, well, you have to teach them how things are structured. So they needed a local class, and now they were looking around, and okay, there are schools all over India. There were madrasas and there were pathshalas, and they didn't meet the British requirements. And so in 1835, something very significant happens. That's the Macaulay educational reforms. And Lord Macaulay, I know that people hate him a lot. I mean, people get very violent at this sometimes. But the fact is that, he was representing British interests, and he was a thorough Englishman, and he said, okay, if we want administrators over here, they've got to be trained like us. And so we will support only those schools where they teach English and science and modern subjects. And those who don't, well, they can continue, but the company, the British East India Company, will not subsidize their education. Now, earlier on, the company didn't give any money at all for education, but there was, within England at that time, the liberals who were saying, we're ruling over a country that is this big, we're benefiting from all the resources that India is providing us, the cotton, the jute, and whatever, and we're sending them textiles in exchange, and now we're ruling over a country that completely lacks education, ideas of democracy, ideas of modernity, and things that have been learned over the Enlightenment period. So the good part of England, I mean the liberals of England, they said, get Macaulay to say this, to declare this. And so that's how this came. Now look at...
I also understand it was the clergy in Britain that forced also education, modern education for the colonized Indians, because they were coming from a religious idea that at least we should impart them the knowledge. It's interesting that the clergy there also was sided with the liberals to create this, I think.
But for their own reason, because they wanted to proselytize.
That's right. They wanted to convert.
And so even after partition, this much later, you see that a lot of schools would teach, even after partition, even after Pakistan was formed, you would have schools like the one that I went to, Karachi Grammar School, where we learned the Bible. Right. We learned catechism, we learned the Lord's Prayer and all that. And so I can only imagine what it must have been 50 or 100 years earlier. The point is, the religious, the evangelists, the proselytizers, they wanted that to happen.
That to happen.
Okay, so 1835, the Macaulay reforms, fiercely resisted by the ulema, Muslims. In fact, in Bengal, there were 8,300 and some Maulvis who said, we don't need your money, we don't need your education, we don't need to learn English, we don't need to learn science or anything that you people have in Europe. We have our book, the holy book, which is true for all times to come. So thank you for the offer, but no thank you. The Hindu reaction was entirely different. Now this was, now I'll tell you that 1835 is one point, okay? But if you look at the years before that, the Hindus were also conservative. I mean, they didn't allow their women to, the women were in parda essentially. They were they were in a completely suppressed lot. There was sati, there was blind obeying, the superstitions were very, very common and so forth. But they were reformers, and chief amongst them, I think, is that of the Brahmo Samaj, so Raja Ram Mohan Roy and several others like him. And they said, look, this is not the way to go. Let's now get into the game. And so 1835, what you see is the Hindus very rapidly accepting modern education, and you see them wanting and demanding more. So then you have the University of Calcutta, I think 1856 or something like that, and the students who go to this university, the first one on the subcontinent, graduate 2 or 3 years later. There's something like over 300 Hindus and only 2 Muslims.
Yeah, you are. Well, it seems like when the British come in and begin from their invasion, if you will, or control from Bengal, that the very first civil servants, the very first to have sided with them in a way are the Hindus, if you will, or non-Muslims, because the power is being taken from the Muslims. They themselves are in both in a resistant or a reactionary phase because the power is being taken from them, and because unfortunately the way they understand or understood their religion was somehow to resist modern education, which somehow the Hindus didn't have the same resistance to that. Maybe also because they were already in the kind of professions, as you were saying, if they were the financiers and the money lenders and the bankers, if you will, they understood that they understood the ways of life, so to speak, practical life, rather than people who were extractive sitting on top.
Yeah, and just wishing for the glory days of the past and living in an imagined universe, right, and saying that our forefathers were the greatest that ever lived, and that it was
right.
If we want to get back there, then well, we have to become more religiously conservative. So yes, that was the reaction at the time.
Reaction that we had. Now you write, Dr. Hoodbhoy, and I quote, "From Mughal days there had been little appetite among India's Muslims for philosophy, science, and reason. In fact, let's go back still further. Ever since the 13th century, Islam's mainstream had rejected its earlier acceptance of Hellenistic thought," unquote. Can you elaborate on this, and why do you think this was? That from 13th century onwards, in a way, the closing of the Muslim mind begins to happen.
Okay, that's a big subject, but just a brief introduction of how science entered into Islam. There was none at the time of the Holy Prophet, but a century after his death, Muslims had already expanded far, far away, and they came into contact with the treasures of Greek civilization, so the works of Aristotle, of Plato, Democritus, Zeno, and so forth. And of course, it was all Greek to them. But they had it translated into Arabic, and the first translators were not Muslims. They were Christians and Nestorians and Jews. But once they got translated, well, the Muslim, the Khalifas, in their darbars, they got fascinated with it, and well, this was a time of plenty. They had conquered vast stretches of the globe by that time, and so there was a curiosity. Hey, what are the Greeks saying? And so that started to get absorbed. And so between the 9th and the 13th century, you see that that Islamic civilization reaches its peak. You see that there are people like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina and 1,000 other scientists and thinkers and philosophers and chemists and astronomers and whatever. Okay, but within Islamic civilization, there was this conflict between those who believed in reason and rationality. So they are the Mu'tazila, and there are the ones who believe in tradition, in belief as is given in the book and not needing to look beyond.
Would it be correct to say, Dr. Hoodbhoy, that the reason and rationality that got into the Muslim societies essentially or basically did come from their study of the Hellenistic or the Greek philosophy and literature before that? Or was it a combination of their own open mind and the fact that they came across this great treasure of the Greek knowledge?
So it's both. They came across this treasure. You had to be able to understand it, and so this caused a kind of schizophrenia. There was so इसको उर्दू में कहते हैं माकुलात और मनकुलात का तजाद, उनका टकराव. So there's maqulat, which is reason, and manqulat, which is what is in tradition and what is there in the books, in the book. This was there. There was a competition between the two at every point between the 9th and the 13th century. But then the traditionalists, the Asharis, they start winning over. And a lot of people blame it on Imam al-Ghazali, who divorced cause from effect. And that's the whole basis of science. And so science went into sharp decline after that, and it has never recovered. So the last great Muslim scientist was, I don't know, you could say Ibn Khaldun, and Ibn Khaldun is 1300 and something. After that, pretty much nothing. Well, you could include Abdul Salam, except that he's not accepted as a Muslim anymore. So that was a tradition of the Arabs, of the Persians, but it did not ever, you see, this is very important to realize, the tradition of rationality never reached India. Islam came to India through invaders, through the Turks, through the Afghans, through the Central Asians, and of course by Muhammad bin Qasim. But Muhammad bin Qasim came before the age of Muslim enlightenment. And
that's right, because if you're saying from 9th to 13th century, he came in the early 8th century.
He came, every Pakistani school child knows the date, 712. 712 was when Pakistan started. That's the dogma.
Right. Okay. So this is then what happens in a way. We miss out on the printing press, the scientific revolution. We miss out on all of that as a result. Now, so you've already talked about very separate reactions from Hindu and Muslim communities to the challenges of modernity. And they were then exacerbated, if you will, because of the Muslim extreme resistance to modernity. Now I quote another section from your book. You write, quote, while the Ashrafia besieged the British for jobs and lands, a militant religious-based movement was out fighting the colonizers and at times also Hindus and Sikhs. These were the Wahhabis, unquote. So was this rise of the militant Islam a new factor due to colonization? That is, we are in a resistance mode now, so we must resist the colonizer, or something old, from what I understand, something old which got a new wind. That you're already talking about the 13th century, the closing of, if you will, of the mind occurs, where the reason and rationality takes a backseat. So this militant Islam, in a way, you would agree, comes from the same closing of the mind, the reaction of the Wahhabis?
The militant Islam did not come because of it didn't come into existence because of the British. It came in the form of extreme conservatism imported from Arabia. Abdul Wahab, this is now the 17th century that Wahhabism starts to spread across India, and it is now the Wahhabis who manage to organize themselves in resistance against, well, not just the British, but also against Shias and against Hindus. And so there is a strain now coming which is becoming increasingly militant, and then and of course Ahmad Shah Barelvi, that resistance over there, which then finally explodes into a full-fledged resistance, militant, violent resistance against the British.
So it seems at every point in time, even though they may not have been directly in power, we seem to have been in the grip or control of forces which you may call militant Islam or conservative Islam, that they had quite a bit of a control, societal control. You write, in very interesting small quotation, British too had the good Taliban and bad Taliban. What do you mean by that?
Well, you know, good Taliban are the Taliban who are with us, the bad Taliban who are fighting us. And exactly the same thing was happening then. The good Taliban were the peers and the mashaykhs who the British could bribe with big land grants, and the bad Taliban were the Wahhabis who were fighting them. So you have the Sufis, the peers who have been co-opted into being with the British, and so yeah, it's a way of political administration. One important thing though I need to point out, and that is, we're talking about the two-nation theory, right? So one reason was that Muslims were less educated and resistant to modern education. The Hindus were less so. Didn't all completely embrace it, but more of them, many more of them embraced it. But look, this was a time of great syncretism. It was very hard to point out, is he Muslim or Hindu, or is he something in between? And a lot of people used to worship, go to a Hindu temple and also go to a masjid and go to a shrine where you would have Hindus and Muslims. Now, here is where something very important happened, and this is the 1870 census. The census seems to be a very innocuous thing, doesn't it? I mean, all I'm asking is, are you Hindu or are you Muslim? But it was not innocuous. It was devastating, because you had to declare whether you are Hindu or you are Muslim. And then that puts a line between them. So this is now where the two-nation theory starts to, two nations, nothing's firm as yet, but the bridge, the chasm between them starts to grow.
So now we are coming to the end of the very first part, and I have one of my sort of last questions, if you will, on the part that I call introduction identity. So to quote you once again, Dr. Saab, quote, ironically, those Indian Muslims who were the most conservative and fought hardest against the British for the glory of Islam got nowhere. Instead, it was the modernist Muslims of India, the ones who chose English education and modernity, who actually succeeded in carving out Pakistan, unquote. So, Dr. Saab, in your opinion, was that because the so-called modernist Muslims, and for that matter the modernist Hindus, were patronized by the British for their own interests? Or was there something else too about them that made them take the lead and deliver the goods?
This is one of the contradictions of education. You educate your children, but you don't know where your children are going to go after that. They could come back and maybe find what you have been teaching them not very good. It could be that they would go wherever their interest takes them. So the British were always quite ambivalent about educating the natives. And this is why there was such a big debate in England in the 18th century and the 19th century, that if we educate these people, who knows, one day they will say, why do we need people, why do we allow people from England to govern us? We are good enough, we are smart enough to understand the world, we've now understood their science, technology, their ways of governance, we can do things for ourselves. And yes, maybe they might have introduced us to some concepts, but now we don't need them anymore. And so it is, I think, such a supreme paradox of history that Pakistan, as a state founded on religious identity, was achieved by those who had only a minimal connection with Islam. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, I mean, yeah, he was formally a Muslim, but was he an actual religious practicing Muslim? Absolutely not. He couldn't speak any local language, couldn't speak Urdu, he couldn't understand anything of Arabic. But he was able to mobilize sentiments, and that's the modernist victory. But you know, the same thing happened with the Hindus. It was Nehru, it was the Congress, secular party, which was already well equipped and well armed in the sense of modern knowledge, and they were able to combat the British on their own terms. And in fact, they showed themselves to be smarter than the British in many things. So this is how human history progresses.
Right. Very interesting, because in terms of the All India Congress's independence movement, they were all modernist, but they also fought very hard. They went to long periods into jails. They were denied a lot of privileges, and yet they borrowed, if you will, their instruments of fighting from the modern knowledge and from a sense of empowerment that modern knowledge gave them. And so did the All India Muslim League leaders, particularly Muhammad Ali Jinnah. So that's very, very, as you said, very well said, a supreme contradiction of that of history. So that brings us to the end of our first part of the book, Pakistan, Origins, Identity and Future, that we are discussing with the author, Dr. Pervez Hoodbhoy. And we will continue now discussing the second part after this break.